industrial institutes which were meant for the laboring entities. Um, and probably once after he's spoken, we can sort of talk about some of the linkages that emerge. So I would like to invite Arun for his talk now.
Thank you so much for this illustrious introduction. I think you summarized my project very well. What I would say in the next, I don't know how many minutes I have.
30 minutes.
30 minutes, right? So in the next 30 minutes, what I'm going to say captures what you summarized here in the deeper aspects of the things that you touched on. I'm grateful to the IIC, particularly Swas Borkaji and Dr. Haim for organizing this. And it is an honor to be here and privilege to be here, particularly in the context that when I was a student at Delhi University, I used to come here and attend talks quite often, quite regularly. I think some of my friends are here, and we used to come together and we used to look forward to the IIC events. So I'm really grateful to the IIC for providing me this platform. When I say that they have provided me platform, they have also provided platform to many workers who are aspiring to be literate in the late 19th and 20th century. So in this talk or lecture, I'm going to talk about them. The words are mine, but the words which are reflecting are their practices. Can I get this? So in the image, you'll see that there are a group of workers. These are essentially indentured workers. It's a painting. These guys are from the late 19th century who have landed in Mauritius. These people basically had some ideas and some aspirations and some dreams. And this talk is tracing those kind of ideas, those dreams in one way or other way. Though not necessarily talking about indentured labor, it will be touching upon a number of different types of laboring bodies. It's right. So what is this lecture about? What I'm going to kind of do in this lecture is that I want to focus on three aspects. One is the explain the nature of modern education and particularly explain its transformation in the 19th and 20th century when the entry of non-elites come into the picture. When people, when social groups, when caste, when classes who are not supposed to be in the school, in the formal setting of education, when they enter into the education system, what happens to the education system? What changes? So essentially, this is the story of the democratization of education, but the democratization of education from the below. The second aspect that I'm going to touch upon is the experience of these people who entered into these institutions, these non-elite social groups, traditionally non-literate caste who came into the education system and how they transformed it. And then finally, I'm going to touch upon or speak a few words and sentences on how did non-elite social groups negotiate and challenge their characterization as illiterates, as someone indifferent to projects of modern education. So these are the key areas that I'm going to focus upon. There will be a bit of contemporary reflection that I'll try to do, but we can touch upon that in the discussion section. Now, let's go directly into the characterization aspect. I was trying to get a sense how were working classes, laboring caste, people who are social groups who are not so-called traditionally literate caste, how were they represented in official writings, in writings of those who provided employment, in writings of those who provided education, so essentially colonial officials, Indian officials, Indian employers. And here is a quote from the chairman of the Mill Owners Association in 1929. Yeah, like that. Yeah. So he writes, this is H.P. Modi, that coming to the question of the want of touch between the employers and the workers, I will not deny it. All I'll say is that there have been excuses for it. The ignorance and illiteracy of the men and the classes from whom they have been drawn have not made it possible for employers of labor to get into the skins of the work people. Now, this kind of characterization of the working class as someone as an illiterate continues in various other sorts of writings. So here is again the Indian Textile Journal, which was the mouthpiece of the Indian Mill Owners Association, writing in 1893. It says, whatever class of work a man gets used to in a mill, he keeps to for the rest of his mill life. If it is blow-room work, neither ambition nor curiosity would ever attract him to the card room or the subsequent process. He learns just as little as will ensure his pay, and their improvement ends. He is of course illiterate, and all machinery deteriorate more rapidly in his hands than those of the Lancashire operatives. Now the idea behind the quote is that the worker is this typical guy who's unaspiring, who's opposed to these ideas of modernity or modern education, and they are antithetical. So the two are kind of not meeting. This characterization kind of continues in other writings as well, which I'll refer. Now, workers, the way they have been represented in secondary scholarship, that is the scholarship that was built in the 1960s, 70s, 80s until now, hasn't touched upon the question of the workers' literacy or the desire for literacy at least, or even their representation. So the colonial period's myth about working class has been appropriated by scholars like us, and they've been put it as it is. Even though the trajectory of the laboring history or the laboring scholarship has changed in India, there are at least three shifts that we can notice in this scholarship. And these are the shifts from working class consciousness to understanding the culture of the workers. And these shifts were made mostly in the 1980s, in the 1990s, with writings of cultural historians, scholars like Chitra Joshi, Rajnarayan Chandavarkar. And within this shift, we also see the emergence of a theme, migration, as a key theme in this, like tracking the indentured labor, the people who moved from rural areas to the urban areas. And then finally, there was also a shift in understanding the working class, not just at the shop floor, that is at the production side, but also in their neighborhood. So looking at their life's aspects such as money lending, drinking, other aspects. But even in these broader shifts, we do not find a literate worker's understanding. We do not know the educational aspects of worker. Now, this is a weakness, this is a shortcoming of the scholarship, or is it the lack of research questions that we post to the archive? I think it's the later one, that we haven't asked right kind of question in the archive to the documents, that we are kind of stuck with that colonial myth of workers as a illiterate. Now, my work tries to kind of move away from this understanding of worker as this working body, as an essentialized laboring body. That worker is the one who always works. At least that's the image, that they work for the whole time and then they sleep and then they kind of again go back to the work. Now, this idea of the labor producing services doing manual labor is something that is stuck. But I want to move beyond that identity. Is there something beyond the life of work that we can find in the working lives? That is the crux of my work. And what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is this shift from beyond their immediate work identity. What do we know, or what can we know about working class? Sorry. Now, this question has been tracked by many scholars in some or other ways, and here I'm just throwing some of the works of scholars based in the Western countries. So we had work of Caroline Steedman, who actually wrote a biographical account of her grandmother, who was a worker. Uh, she, I think, taught at Warwick University, and she talked about this culture of lack and longing in her mother's and in her grandmother's life. And similarly, we have French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who basically attacked this idea of that worker always live this proud working class identity, that they always carry this identity everywhere. He says that this is a myth that has been created by the party politics in the context of the France, and that we don't need to kind of follow as a scholar this myth of workers' love for work. And in the context of America, we have Richard Sennett and Jonathan Cobb, who try to understand. These are sociologists working in the 1960s and 70s who interviewed a large number of working population in America, and they try to kind of get a sense that what is it that the workers wanted, and they found out that there is a deep-seated longing for a respectable life. You also get a hint of this in Karl Marx's writing when he says that the industrial life produces an alienated life. The worker wants to move beyond that, but he's stuck, he or she is stuck in that. Now, I want to kind of take this forward. इसमें कुछ इजाफा करना चाहता हूँ, this understanding that has come of. So, I want to begin, sorry, I think I moved the, right. I want to begin with a poem of a worker poet. His name is Narayan Surve. He's a Marathi poet. Many of you would know him and his writings, his poems. He was a worker. He was an orphan who was raised by mill workers, and then he became a child worker in a mill. Later, he became a night worker in a mill. But over the period of time, he was just, I think, class 2 standard pass out. But he became a very famous poet in the post-colonial India. And he wrote a poem called Char Shabd, which basically kind of captures the essence of what I'm trying to say. And I'm going to read this poem for all of you. It says, the struggle for the daily bread is an everyday question. At times outside the door, at times inside. I'm a worker, a flaming sword. Listen, you intellectuals, I'm going to commit a crime. I have suffered, witnessed, explored a bit. The sweet ache of my word lies in it. I have messed up, missed out, and learned new stuff. The way I live, that's the way I'm in my words. Bread is my first love. I agree, but I need something more. And I want to emphasize here, bread is my first love. I agree, but I need something more. That's why my words casting the royal seal. It's here that I drop flowers into the palm of my words. It's here that I give swords into the hands of my words. I haven't arrived alone. The epoch is with me. Be aware, this is the beginning of the storm. I am a worker, a shining sword. Listen, you intellectuals, a crime is about to happen. So in a way, Narayan Surve captures this fire within himself, that his life is just not about work. His life is just not about the materialities of earning bread. His life is much more than that, and he wants to kind of capture that essence through his writings, through his poems. And what I'm going to do is to basically unpack or basically broaden this at other levels, not just through poems, but through other. Now, the problem with this kind of work is that the archive, where do you find the workers writing? How do you kind of track their desires, their aspirations, their understanding of education? It's very difficult. So what I did, I think Professor Saeed Amin is here. What I do is a lot of what subaltern scholars had done back in the past in the 1980s and 90s, that is to read the archive against the grain, the colonial archive, the archive of the master, the colonial master. And what I'm adding is that I'm also reading the archive of the colonial caste elites, the Indian elites. And what we find in that archive is a very interesting anxiety, which I call as an elite anxiety. Now, this elite anxiety is that lower working caste and classes should not abandon their hereditary manual laboring occupation lives or the assigned social role. So this anxiety is continued to be reflected and depicted in many of the writings in the 19th and 20th century that you find in newspapers, in the judgments, and in several sociological writings. And I'll try to give you a few examples to give you a sense of this anxiety that was shared within the larger elite official circles. Now, here is, I'll start with a Protestant missionary. Protestant missionaries are very interesting set of people in the 19th and 20th century. They are usually associated with opening education for Dalits, the untouchable, so-called the untouchable castes of India, the laboring poors. And they are truly the one who revolutionized the Indian education system. They provided an avenue. But at the same time, what I see in their writings is also an anxiety that the Dalits want something more from them. And here, D.C. Churchill, who is a Protestant missionary, he's saying, born into the traditional state of the outcast, taking their allotted place in the social ladder, made up of all classes, reaching from those who furnish the labor at the bottom to those at the top, whose two chief distinctions are that they are educated and that they do not labor. It is no wonder that Indian Christians, even more than American Negro, have come to feel that education will emancipate the uneducated from labor. So this capture, this sense, the life beyond labor is something that he is stuck about the Dalits' desire. That he thinks that when Dalits come to their missionary schools, they think that it will emancipate them from manual labor, from the drudgeries of hard work. And missionaries, quite often, I wrote a paper on this in the journal, South Asia, Journal of South Asia, called the Untouchable School, the first Untouchable Schools. It basically kind of captures these anxieties, these efforts. On the one hand, there is an attempt to bring these lowest caste, these ex-untouchable caste into the fold of education, at the same time to contain them within the laboring fold. Now, let's move on to some of the other kind of anxieties. And here, I want to move on to the writings of editorials which were being written in the North Indian dailies. So here is Kanpur Gazette editorial from 1897. Sorry, this is a long quote, so I'm going to read it, but it kind of captures the anxiety that I just mentioned. And this is in the 1897 when the state has theoretically said that all the schools, the government schools, are open to all caste and community. So this was one of the kind of ways the government, colonial government, the British government in India was saying that, look, our education system is much more modern. But essentially what they were saying was that since they are taking an educational cess, what they call the educational tax, from all the agricultural classes and castes, they had to make the education open because it was essentially funded by the peasantry. The schools had to be theoretically open. But whether the students came into the school or the experience is something another matter. But anyway, the schools were theoretically open to all the caste. And this is Kanpur Gazette in 1897. The editorial runs like this. The country is exposed to a number of misfortunes such as poverty, famine, plague, cholera, earthquake, and there is no knowing what new calamities are still in store for it. Famine, earthquake, and plague are natural calamities and must be due to causes known to the God. But the question is what has led to the poverty, increase of religious prejudice and crime and so on. The writer is of opinion that these evils are due to the spread of education among the lower classes of people who have abandoned their hereditary professions, look to government service as the only means of gaining livelihood, and are misbehaving themselves, their moral characters not having been respectable as well as the lower classes, the community. General education is thus the root of all the evil. The writer does not mean that the lower classes should be excluded from receiving education, but only the former should be eligible for appointment to post under government, the latter being compelled to stick to the hereditary professions after completing their education. If such a policy were adopted, the country would soon rise in prosperity. What the author is saying that there should be status quo, and what he's also saying is that there should be education, but then the education should be contained, it should be regulated, it should be controlled. The elite anxiety that I discussed, that if education is democratized, there is a fear that there will be a social revolution in this period. Now, again, a newspaper from Lucknow, Anjuman-e-Hind, 1898. All of this you can get from the native newspaper reports, which are kept in the British Library. As government had opened its school and colleges to all sections of the community, the sons of oilmen, distillers, shoemakers, and other such low classes of people have been receiving education and obtained post under government. But it is very disagreeable to persons of high caste to appear as suitors or vakils before a low caste judge, or to place their sons under the tuition of a low caste schoolmaster. Government should regard the feelings of the people and exclude the lower classes from schools and the public services. Now, these people are kind of conceptualizing what should be the nature of the education then. And these kind of fears of elites against the lower classes are not particular to India. They're also shared in England against the working classes, in England against the ex-slaves in America. So here is a MP, which I'm not going to read the quote, but it captures this fear of this conservative MP in the parliament. And there is a bill which this is a parochial school bill that they're debating in the British parliament, and he is also kind of having this similar kind of fear that we don't want a social revolution because of the education. Essentially, what these people are doing are theorizing and discussing the nature of education as it is opening to new members, to a new social group. So what should be its nature? Oh. So this is an Irish professor who wrote in an Irish journal, T. Corcoran. He basically sums up what these anxieties are. He says it was a maxim of the governing classes: workers of any grade must be educated to be efficient in that grade and to remain in it. A narrow ladder leading out of that area may be tolerated. A broad highway would mean a social revolution. He's saying in the context of England and America. Now, what I'm saying is that these fears are then global in nature. These fears are a response to a bigger shift that is happening in the education system, and that is the democratization of the education system, the entry of the so-called non-literate classes into the education system. So this produces a conundrum within the education system. And this conundrum is that efforts to democratize education for laboring subalterns who are destined to labor, that who are supposed to do the job of whatever traditional professions that their parents or their ancestors had been doing, who are destined to do labor, were burdened with fears that such an education might collapse the social economic balance of society. So what is the solution? The solution is to come up with an education that would kind of contain these fears, that would respond to these fears. And this leads to the birth of industrial and practical education that was also responsive to the needs of industrial system that was emerging in this period. So education to laboring subalterns was not offered with a promise to social mobility, but as a strategy to improve their productivity and skills and integrate them into various regimes of modern day labor, so such as factory labor, machine workshops, machinery industries, modern infrastructural projects such as Ganges Canal, the road building that was being carried out in the 19th century and 20th century. Now the question is that, how many minutes do I have? Right, great. I have 10 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to use all the 10 minutes to kind of shift on the different aspect of the paper or the lecture, which is to get a sense, once these so-called non-traditional literate caste entered into the education, what was their experience? So I'm now shifting the attention from the elite anxieties and the fears to the experience. And here I want to bring in what Haim mentioned, that is the institutional, the micro-institutional histories that I did. Now I worked upon a number of non-elite schooling which traditionally have not been looked in Indian scholarship, such as industrial schools, night schools, factory schools. Now the histories of these sort of non-elite institutions has not been captured, and essentially these are the institutions where the majority of the labor actually went as subject, because these were free institutions and they were particularly targeted to different kind of laboring bodies. Some were, for example, industrial schools were targeted for artisanals, factory schools were targeted for mill workers, children, and mill workers themselves. Night schools again were targeted to various types of laboring bodies who used to work in the daytime and didn't have time to study in the day. So here I'm going to mention two cases. One is of the Lucknow Industrial School and the other one is of the Bombay's Night School. Now, the case of the Lucknow Industrial School is very interesting. The Lucknow Industrial School was an government institution which was inaugurated by the Governor General Colvin in the 1892, and it was affiliated to the Lucknow Railway Charbagh workshop. If you have been to Lucknow Charbagh, it's a big station, and they had a locomotive and carriage workshop, and it needed large number of labor, particularly carpenters, blacksmiths, mechanics. So this school kind of came as in kind of with an idea that it will support the workshop in terms of providing the labor. Now, when it was started, it was a free institution only open for artisan caste. So only sons of artisans were admitted in the institution. They would be given free books, they would be given free classes, there would be a workshop in the school, and there will be some literary training in English, in Hindi, and some knowledge of science, arithmetic, and other subjects. Now, what's interesting is that these institutions kept running for the next 8-9 years, but there was a conflict between the students, parents, and the teachers, especially the authorities of the railway workshop and the school authorities and the students. This conflict was situated around how much should be literary component in the school, how many of hours should be devoted to English and drawing and to other literary components, and how much of school time should be devoted to the workshop, affiliated workshops. So there were, initially there were 3 workshops: carpentry, blacksmithy, and glass blowing, and then later there were other workshops. So half of the time usually was associated with the workshops and half of the time was supposed to be spent, very similar to what we have like the ITIs. So it's a precursor of the ITIs. Now, the school found that these artisans' sons are using education to become schoolmasters. At that period, the colonial government did something very interesting. It introduced drawing as a compulsory subject, at the high school level, and they needed a large number of teachers who knew the art of drawing, especially geometrical drawing, freehand drawing, and also a large number of draftsmen were also needed outside of the school. So what happened, that these school students used the knowledge of their literary component but also drawing to get the schoolmaster instead of going to the railway workshop. Now the school authorities were obviously not happy because the school was not meeting. It was a very premium institution, large money was being spent, the whole education was free, so it came directly from the government's revenue. So the governor was not happy, and they invited what was then the principal of the Thomson Roorkee College, today's IIT Roorkee. So they called him saying that, can you actually intervene and get to know what's actually happening in the school? Why are these kids not joining the workshop as laborers, as carpenters, as smiths? So anyway, what happens is that this guy, this principal, Atkinson, he does a detailed report about a student's career, those who had passed out, and he finds out very interestingly, saying that these students actually do not come to the school to become laborer, because they're saying that they can become laborer by joining or by becoming an apprentice to an ustad. They don't need to come to the school to become a skilled laborer. So they said they would rather go and become an kind of shagird of an ustad in the railway workshop directly than to come to the school. Instead, they come to the school to dream or to kind of get something which they can't get from the normal apprenticeship system. So Atkinson kind of writes this huge report, which is kept in the National Archives of Delhi, in Delhi. So this conflict continues in 1901, 1902. By the time it was so bigger that the institute has to be closed down because hardly any student was going in the railway workshop. So the state basically said that, look, I can't give you funding. Okay, you have to stop down. So the school remains closed for almost 1 year, and then later they kind of bring in a new principal from Manchester, saying that you start. And what he does is that he says that first thing I'm going to do is that I'm not going to call it Lucknow Industrial School. I'm going to call it Lucknow Technical School, because that's something that it shows that I'm giving something different. So he calls the Lucknow Technical School, and by the 1910 he kind of revives it to some extent, but it becomes a very critical institution during the First World War, because a lot of support that came in terms of the skilled labor this institution provided in kind of specialized skilled labor in terms of producing ammunition and other things. So, so if we move to another setting in Bombay, were workers interested in education? If you remember the quote that I started with, Mill Honors Association, that workers are indifferent to education, that they don't want education. Actually, if you look at the histories of the night schools, which I tracked, we find that actually workers were not simply just doing labor. They were actually, some of them were becoming students, not necessarily all of them. There were about 100,000 workers at the turn of the century in Bombay. But at least every year, 2,000 students were kind of going in the school, in these night schools. These night schools are very peculiar institutions. You don't get much knowledge about them because they are very ephemeral. So they would be there for 2-3 years and they would just disappear because they don't have any kind of direct source of funding, government funding. These are very much kind of community initiated schools, sometimes run by charities, sometimes run by workers themselves, sometimes run by formal institutions such as Bombay Service League. So workers in Bombay attended night schools between 7 to 9 p.m. or until later after they had kind of returned from work. I try to get a sense of the numbers because proportions are quite important in this kind of work. So between 1886 and 1890, about 2,750 workers studied at night schools. Both child and adult workers attended the same school. Apparently, there were separate schools for Dalit workers. Now, these workers were mill workers, postmen, people who worked in the railway, in the GIPR railway workshop, people such as who provided services like milkmen, vendors, these kind of workers who worked in the day and then later kind of went to the school. Here is a picture of the night school. Now, this is a very unique picture. Usually, the pictures of the workers in the 19th and 20th century are that the workers are half clad. They are not very well dressed. In this picture, you'll see that the workers are not only well dressed, but they also have a topi, like a cap, which was a source of, which was a kind of a symbol of respectability in this period. They are also holding the book. So in a way, although it might be a staged photo, it kind of shows a different angle, a completely different angle to the working class. So what we find is that by 1919, it is reported that Bombay city had about 50 night schools which catered to an average daily attendance of 1,200 to 1,500 students. These schools were located in chawls in various neighborhoods of Bombay, such as Parel, Chinkpokli, and others. The Social Service League was one of the institutions that ran these schools, but one of the kind of initiators of these schools was Bhiwaji Nare, who was a worker, who was a mill weaver, and he established the first night school in 1874. It was a free school for students of mill workers. I'm going to come to the conclusion. I think that will be, I think I've got 2-3 minutes, so, but I think I want to conclude. But the idea is to kind of tell all of you that there is an effort on the part of the working classes to kind of go to the institution, cut down their sleep, sacrifice their sleep after working 12 or 13 hours. Now, the question is that, sorry, this is the one of the libraries that still exist. This is in the Chinkpokli areas. It now has 21,000 books. It was started in 1917. It was a working class library that was started by the Bombay Social Service League. Yeah, there is a question that I had. like guessing the literacy rates. We don't get a proper literacy rates of workers because the census didn't carry out like a class-wise census. So here is a Maurice de Morris, an economic historian, who did a survey in 1940. He says that the average literacy rates among workers was 29.7%, which got increased to 42.5% in 1955. And he noted the experiences of collective reading. So, for example, he would kind of write down that how workers are reading newspaper together at the stairs or in the mill premises. So it's a kind of a collective reading that he emphasizes on. Now, this is the last slide that I want to kind of zoom on, which is that why is it that workers are so much interested in the illiteracy? I mean, they could have just worked and slept, and what is the point, right? And it has to offer some immediate benefit to their life, and I think it does to their lives. The world that the workers were living in, especially in areas like Bombay and Lucknow, the world was changing very fast. Now, as it is changing very fast. A lot of people who labor, they want their kids to be educated. They want to be kind of gel or in kind of symphony with changing world. I think similar things were happening in this period. There was a coming of railway, there was coming of postal services, there was coming of remittance, letter writing. I wrote a piece on letter writing, basically building upon this idea of subaltern literacy. But I think there are a few things which are quite important. One is that this idea of holding books and enjoying the privilege of reading, which had been denied to these social groups, these social castes for centuries, for structural reasons, whether it is caste, whether it is poverty, whether it is excess. So it is the very idea that you are in the institution, that you can hold the book, that you can buy the book, that you get the book, right? It was not easy to buy the books in this period, and the Social Service League, what these institutions did was that they provided free education, free books, free tools, free paper, which was difficult for a worker who was probably earning 16 anna or 1 rupee or 2 rupees a month. The other thing I think that I find is that workers are very much interested in reading certain type of literature. So I find evidences of workers holding collective religious readings early in the morning in mill chawls. So they're reading religious literature together. They're also reading political literature together in this period on holidays or in the morning when they have some time. The other thing is, of course, reading and writing of letters become very common. The idea of the mass letter writing emerges in this period. You might know something called penny post, and workers kind of made penny post success because they were writing in this period. Also the remittance, but most importantly, they were also emerging as poets and writers, which were also kind of co-opted by various bodies such as the labor movement. The state also was interested in workers who knew how to read and write, so they were co-opted. The mill authorities co-opted, and then of course the workers themselves went to much more respectable, what they were supposed to be respectable non-laboring jobs. I would stop here. Thank you so much for being so patient.
Thank you, Arun. I think the sort of attention of the audience is a testimony that to how engaging your talk was. I think what Arun's talk really captures very well is something that we see all through the history of education in terms of marginalized groups. It's a paradoxical situation. So on one hand, education is very emancipatory. On the other hand, it becomes a tool for social reproduction. But what Arun brings to the table is that if you pay close attention and you listen, to the sort of archival material that he's unearthed, he sort of finds that probably the intended consequence of these institutions was to, as I said, and as he said, I mean, drawing from him, that it was a bifurcation, it was to build on a caste hierarchy to keep people where they are, very status quoist. They were essentially technical institutes to build skilled labor. But what actually happened inside is that the working class who came there nurtured lofty desires. They wanted different jobs. they were like, oh, this is something we have, ये तो हम उस्ताद और शागिर्द से सीख सकते हैं, but we want something different, we want something else. So their aspirations could not be contained and their aspirations couldn't be constrained. And I think that's so much of what the beauty of education lies in. It also sort of demolishes the myth, and I think it's a myth that persists even today, of a sort of indifference that working class has to education. I think it sort of brings to light that it was in fact completely to the contrary. And I think it also, another thing that it brings to light is that before I read Arun's work, we often sort of look at colonial education policy for marginalized entities, whether it's gender, whether it's, sort of scheduled caste, whether it's scheduled tribes, as, sort of a treatment to the special classes, right? But what you sort of bring out is that in the technical education institutes or the industrial institutes, this was all sort of factored in. So I think that is something that is very, very helpful and different. I was thinking that probably we should open the house for questions. Probably, I mean, I think I've sort of pointed out two things to think about. As a as somebody who works on the anthropology of education, we often find that the debates in contemporary times are very situated in the sort of paths that have been carved out by colonial history, and not the typical simplistic thing of, colonial education project produced clerks, people to service the colonial regime, but something more deeper and nuanced and more complicated. And I think your work is one representative of this. And I would also like to flag that, so for example, Ajanta Subramaniam's work on the caste of merit, where she looks at IIT, Chennai, and talks about that how it was actually the caste capital which transforms into what we popularly understand as merit, and and then use that to question what we sort of think of as special privileges. It's very interesting if you look at this history, if you go deep into the roots. So first you see that there's a bifurcation, whereas apprenticeship and guild, sort of guild-based artisanal work is taken out from engineering knowledge and, confined to technical and industrial institutes. And then engineering becomes, to make it something of high status. It's sort of, there is a collaboration between the elites, the colonial elites and the Indian elites. And then coming full circle, so the engineers play an important part. They're like nation builders, so on and so forth, temples of modern India. And then it's like this entire group, the knowledge, the skills has been sort of graded down and become a sole repository of the lower caste. And the entire, the question that comes back is that, oh, but they were never interested in education in the first place. As though there is something innately, you have to possess some innate qualities to even do education in the first place. And I think your work really questions that, Arun. And I think that's something that I would just like to flag. And I open the house for questions. So maybe if we could have a show of hands, or I mean, we could do it that way. I think that would just make it more systematic.
Can I ask a question? You talked about the emergence of poets and writers. Could you elaborate on that? Because I think that's a very interesting facet of that time, and how the poets and writers are emerging from the working classes. And the second part, I would like you to, what is the impact of all this on trade unionism, especially in a place like Bombay?
Right. I think the two aspects are interlinked. Some of the poets from the working class which emerged, they were co-opted by the trade unionists as people who would carry the masses forward to the masses. There is a very good poem. There was a Meerut conspiracy trial in the 1929, and as part of the proceedings, they collected exhibits from the houses of workers. And one of the exhibits is actually a poem that the court captures. And this poem is actually very huge, large poem, building upon the experience of the 1928 strike. It's a journalist strike in Bombay. And it represents the whole strike in the way as if it was the battle of the Mahabharata. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of poets and writers which emerged in this period, who might have benefited from the night schools, or who might have benefited from very meagre education that they got, someone like Narayan Surve, who just was educated until second standard, they used those skills to kind of build a revolutionary ideas or movement. Having said so, there is also a kind of sad story attached to it, and which is the story of the trade union movement in India, that they failed to build upon this in creating a wider reading culture, as was the case in the West, I would say. For example, in the UK, the labor movement was also closely associated with creating what they call the Working Class Education Association. So people like E.P. Thompson, who were the kind of historian of the working classes, they would also teach to workers in the evening. But that sort of history we miss. So the big the trade union or working class association bodies in the late 1920s, when the labor movement was at the height, at its peak in Bombay, they only had one or two libraries. They never kind of tried to kind of build a literate working class. And this is something that Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya reflects upon. He wrote a very wonderful piece called The Outsider. And this role, the figure of the outsider in the trade union, in the labor politics, is quite interesting, that the leader is always from the outside. This communist who comes, who's from the literate world. So there is always a disjuncture between the masses who are to be led and the communist leader. So this phenomena of the outsider is something I think was one of the reasons that kind of did not allow to kind of create a more literate, more politically conscious working class in this period, in the way that it should have been, I think. I think Kerala, on the other hand, offers a very different model, where actually they built up libraries system and actually relied on this spreading of education.
Please ask your question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to listen to you. There are two comments that I would like to make. What I understand implicitly from your presentation is that the workers wanted to have not skill-based training, but education. So this is a dramatic change in their attitude towards that. So the purpose of education was seen differently. Today the argument is that you should not have general education, you should have more training. Even universities should become or degenerate into training institutions. The employers are blaming the universities because they are not producing job-specific skills. So there's a dramatic change that has taken place. As a historian, how do you reflect it? Second, the debate today is that whether admission should be merit-based or potential-based.
Or
Potential-based. Because when we talk about admissions to IITs, I'm not talking about NEET or anything, even based on the marks secured in the secondary levels of education to the colleges, etc., merit-based admission reveals what is the past history of the student, what you've done. But education should be based on what is your potential. That's the latest argument that you find in education. So when you look at from this point of view, how these qualifications or these education systems that you're talking about, or orientation towards qualification, is going to change the world of education, not only of workers, but generally. Because when you have around 43 million students in a higher education institution, we are not talking about a small number. We are talking about a large country.
Right.
Not even a small country, If you compare with the European countries, except one or two countries, the population will be less than 44 million. So how do you adjust that within your framework, Because I was not letting the second part, merit versus this potential, I was getting a little lost in terms of the way that you are presenting it. Thank you.
Right. I think I'll just come to the second part because it's quite important. probably I haven't thought in the terms that you have phrased it, the merit versus potential. Um, what's happening in the past is what Haim was saying, that there is something innate in you that will qualify whether you should be getting a literary education or whether you should not get education, or you should be in a vocational or skill-based. Um, I think I get the point about the potential-based admission, but like as his historian, well, I think it needs to be regulated and supervised very well, because how would you judge anyone's potential, and how you can say that yes, I have potential, because it's such a subjective thing, right? A committee would say that yes, you have a potential. What is it that would stop them saying that these social groups have this kind of potential, right? Or these social groups have this. I'm just saying this is just a possibility. While it's interesting, I would like to know and understand more about this potential, because I'm hearing it for the first time. The other question about the skill, you made a very interesting point that there is a great, like a general skill drive which is happening because of the new education policy. I think there is a kind of framework of a greater drive towards making education more skill oriented, more vocational oriented. The problem there is that one is that how do you kind of make people understand that this skill-based education is it will elevate you, that there are certain conceptions in the society which are, as I said, are associated with certain social groups, that if you look at the kind of traditional development of the ITIs, and the IITs have been associated with different social groups, right? The ITIs are associated usually with the peasant, with the low earning, and also probably coming from more socially marginalized, I would assume, although there is no survey as such that I rely on. But I'm saying is that there is a certain tendency that we associate with skills, and how do you kind of stop that kind of taking over in the institutions, that I think needs to be watched. And when as we are seeing this greater skill kind of, there is also question of infrastructure. Are teachers equipped in Delhi University to kind of provide skill-based education? What kind of vocation actually are you going to offer? Is it only lip service, or is it really kind of an education that would empower, that would provide higher technical and higher scientific education? One of the things which is very interesting, even nationalist movement relied on this notion that our education should be very skill oriented. So if you look at the Gandhi's Vardha scheme in the late 1930s, it is very much skill craft oriented based. But what's interesting is that there are a number of other nationalists who are saying actually, yes, we need that, but we need higher technical education, higher scientific education. So that would kind of take us into more kind of a modern occupations, rather than kind of just learning spinning or just learning weaving, which is more kind of a craft based. So yeah, I'm sorry, I think I don't have the perfect answer to your question, but I would love to know more and understand from you.
Yes, please. Dinesh.
Thanks, Arun, for this. Following up the last two questions. So you started with this thing that there's a shift in the history writing in South Asia on the working class movement, and there's a shift from the working class consciousness, sort of an understanding of working class to a more of a working class culture. Do you think, so do you suggest a third way of understanding it? So neither working class consciousness, that is what we are doing, and there's a subaltern or Rajchandra kind of perspective on the working class culture. Second thing, also when you spoke about reading culture and the outsiders, E.P. Thompson, you are forgetting there's something very interesting happening here, that the working class movement in England is actually just follows up the charter movement. So the working class in England becomes a very important stakeholder in the, even in the moment of the founding of democratization of the English society, whereas in India there is a gap of almost 50 years. So you have a first working class which is there, and there's a certain democratization 1947. So they are not really a stakeholder in a sense of. So when you are an outsider, you choose the example of E.P. Thompson. I think in India there's a thousands of examples of E.P. Thompsons. You have read the history of Bombay working class. We all are aware of Shailendar. We know about Cafe Azmi. So everyone was very much involved in the working class movement as an outsider. But what is also happening that these outsiders also understand. So these are elite who doesn't have any anxieties about working class becoming educated. They are actually really interested in educating them, which is a very counter to what you begin with. So how you actually sort of bring these two things together? Thank you.
Thank you for asking such a brilliant question. Yes, I'm trying to kind of move away from, in terms of the scholarship, I want to kind of create kind of a newer understanding about the working class, about the working people, laboring caste. So I kind of club them together to kind of get a sense that there is a life beyond labor, there is life beyond their immediate identity that they inhabit in that social, and that we need to kind of capture. Education is just one framework. It could be used to kind of develop a sense of their sporting culture, their literary culture, their reading and writing, in terms of political culture that they are following, right? So in a way, the life beyond work, as a framework that I'm developing, as a methodological framework, could be used to follow their music preferences, right? All sorts of. I think the point about the Chartist movement, the Chartist movements, and the working class population's involvement, I think you're right, because they are kind of going hand in hand in England and in India. Although there is not such a kind of a clear symphony between the two, due to the lack of structural representation of the laboring caste and the laboring people in the institutions. But I think that doesn't stop the working classes to kind of demand a certain kind of education, as I see. And this is just not about the political representation, it is also about kind of living a certain kind of life. But even about the political representation, from the 1930s onwards, with the coming of the franchisee committee, a lot of artisanal caste, a lot of laboring peasant caste started demanding representation, and that history actually has not been traced at all. If you look at the files in the National Archives, the representations which were being sent to the franchisee committee, to the Simon Commission, a lot of communities which are traditionally so-called the non-literate caste actually are saying that we need education, but we also need a representation in legislative bodies, in the gram panchayats, in the in the provincial legislative bodies, and also in the government employment. With the army, they had already started demanding in the late 19th century, particularly the Dalits in Maharashtra, and some of the social groups in North India. They started demanding even like as early like 1890s. So you see, there are certain kind of attempt, but you're right that it's actually the two are kind of not necessarily as closely linked as they are in England. Yeah, Sandeep has a question.
Please take the mic, recorded.
So it's a kind of curiosity, what was the caste composition of the laborers? And the second thing is that, what was the caste composition of the leadership of the labor union at that time? Because that was the time, roughly 1890. This Narayan Surve is a Marathi Dalit poet, and literature for the lower castes and working class is a kind of luxury, still luxury in India. If you see the list of the literatures in the country, majority of them are from the intermediary caste and the upper caste, because they can afford only literature. They can just think. See, the lower caste people also think, they have emotions, they have everything, but they can't document. And apart from that, there is lots of this politics of publication. They don't have that much of resource to document all these things. So the first question is that what was the composition, since you just went through the archives, and the leadership caste composition also, and the third thing, like where did they migrate from, like Khandes, Marathwada, Vidarbha, or the central India? Like migration too would have not been very easy, and that was the time when the cotton industry started crumbling from India. Like Japan started a kind of skilling their laborers in their country, and having the elementary education completely, they opened a university. So, but India was a kind of force in cotton industry. They they were a force, India. But after that, after 2-3 decades, it completely crumbled, collapsed, and all the
Right.
So that is my thing. Is it linked with that thing also? Because
Right.
elite and elite versus non-elite, and labor versus the feudal mindset people who they were owning the majority of the cotton industry owners were from this Marwadi origin. Actually, they minted money.
I mean, you're right in terms of the ownership. The management of the mills was predominantly in the hands of Parsis and merchants from Gujarat and Bombay industrialists. Um, in terms of the caste composition in the schools, the Lucknow Industrial School is predominantly lower caste because it's only open to the artisanal caste. So only those kids could come, right? And they had 20 seats for general, like anybody could come. So it was predominantly a kind of a lower caste institution. In Bombay, interestingly, you had separate Dalit night schools which were open, and then you had night schools and night libraries for backward classes. What the term was used as in kind of not in the caste sense, but in the sense of backward class in this period, and they predominantly use the class language in this period in terms of saying that our schools are mostly for the working people, the working hand. That's the term. So you don't get like much a sense of like exactly what is the kind of real caste composition of the of these night schools, because those kind of statistics were never calculated or never collected, done. Similarly, I think the trade union leaders, I guess, we don't have that kind of data. Like the upper rungs, we know like who are the leaders, and those were mostly the literate, and most of the time, often from outside the mill industries. Though there were also labor leaders coming from someone like Alve, even Surve was a labor leader. So there were people who, but not necessarily at the kind of upper rungs. Yeah.
We can take one last question. Yes. Okay. Okay. So 2 more questions then.
One question from this side. My name is Ranveer Kumar. I listened to your talk. Thank you very much. I would like to know about the gender education that time, whether it was totally prohibited for the girls or female, or it was just dominated by. Any idea about that? Any studies you have found?
Usually the skill question was kind of dominated by the male students. There were some industrial schools for females, but they were mostly opened by the missionaries because they had to kind of take care of the people who had converted to the Christianity. And they wanted to create a skill. So, for example, the missionaries in North India and Kanpur had a female missionary industrial school, which was closely working with the mills in Kanpur, and those girls were producing boots, stitching boots for the Allen and Cooper company. But the same is true in the context of the southern India, where missionaries established industrial schools for women, but again kind of training very domestic oriented crafts, so stitching, tailoring, embroidery. In fact, the United Provinces government, which is today's roughly Uttar Pradesh government, they had a needle school, government needle school, but it wasn't successful, so it stopped. Yeah, we don't get much information about that. So it predominantly remained a very male-oriented phenomena.
No, I'll just make some observations regarding this labor issue because you see, I think the first labor leader of India, I think Lokhande, he was born in 1848, the year in which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels they released their Communist Manifesto. So it's interesting to reflect on that, because his contributions, he was the first labor leader. Because I remember when I was working with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he released a stamp on Lokhande. Okay, so I don't know what his contributions could be, you might be knowing. The second point is that when Gandhi wrote his book, wrote his first petition while in South Africa, I mean, that he has written in his book, Satyagraha in South Africa. The first thing that he did to draft the petition was to go to the laborers, that time the indentured laborers. And he was criticized for that. Why are you consulting the laborers? What do they know? Gandhi being a lawyer, he was advised to draft the petition, there was no need to consult the laborers. But what he wrote in that book is very interesting. He said, the laborers has as much right or faculty to split their brains on any issue as anybody else, including the business people or the literate. And consistently, he has been taking a stand to take up the cause of the labor. See, Ahmedabad mill, first strike which he resolved after coming to India. And then his constructive program containing 18 points, one of the points was on labor. So I thought I must just flag these points, that's all. I didn't
Agree. I think you're right. In fact, just one brief point. Lokhande actually was very much into the education. There has been a lot written on Lokhande, so including a lot of biographies on him. But Lokhande also gave 50 rupees to the schools which were run for the workers, the night schools. So he contributed in the 1880s. So he was very much open to these questions, but I agree with all of your points. Thank you.
Hi. I have two questions, very quick ones. First one is, do we have statistic of?
Could you also introduce yourself?
Oh yeah,
It is-
I'm Shivakshi, and I think that's enough. I guess. Yeah. Okay. So I have two questions. First one is, do we have statistic of things that the workers like, or the nature of things that they like? For example, this is a literary skill. So it's one of those things that they like reading poems. So is there any other, or maybe some recorded narratives in any of the archives? That's my first question. Second is, do we also see those elite anxieties that you were talking about in late 20th or early 21st century? Because currently also a lot of upskilling work is going on, and there's a new concept of knowledge capital that's coming up. So it's moving away from the, I think, the industrial skills, but towards the knowledge skills. For example, soft skills is one of those examples. So do we see elite anxieties there as well? So training is changing from industrial to more knowledge based, soft skill based. So do we see the anxieties? First is, do we have any recorded narrative of that? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of the statistics, we don't get a sense like what is the priority in terms of the priorities, right? Because those sort of sociological studies were never done about the working classes in Bombay in this period. You get some reflections in terms of what the workers are reading in court records when they write, or for example, when the police seizes their houses, they also kind of made a kind of list of inventory what a worker kind of had in the house. So you get a sense of what kind of things they're reading from those kind of records. The second is quite interesting, and I do not know much about the contemporary, what kind of anxieties are there. I think this is a subject that him would be more appropriate to talk. But what I understand from the 20th century is that I was recently working at Prime Minister's Museum and Library, the erstwhile Nehru Memorial and Museum and Library. I was reading the letters of Gandhi and his correspondence with his associates. And Gandhi is very anxious to know what's happening to his Vardha scheme. And this is Villiers Alvin, who's writing from Bastar. He sent a kind of very anxious letter to Gandhi in the 1930s saying that, dear Bapuji, we have started the school here in Bastar among the tribals. But the thing is that we are teaching them weavers, but there is already a kind of a notion about weaving among the tribals that it is not something to be learned in the school. So they are kind of basically not interested in learning in the weaving that we are teaching in the school. Is there something that we can do about it? So Veeran Alvin is kind of very anxious that whether this project would be successful in the longer term. I think that continues to be the case even now. What's interesting is, like, if you see the kind of shopping malls in India, a lot of workers who are working there are very precariously employed workers. But what does the skill education kind of does is that it gives them this false promise that they are kind of new type of worker who work in these kind of fancy institutions or fancy places, but actually they are kind of very much devoid of any of the social rights or social security rights that they should have in terms of health benefits or pension or a number, like even formal contract. So I think there are anxieties even from the working side with the skill program that is running and the kind of jobs that they probably are going to get in future. Right. Yeah.
Close it. A big thank you to all of you for being here today, and to our speaker, and to India International Center for organizing this again at very short notice. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
and have a good night.
Yeah, thank you so much. आप लोग सब लोग यहाँ आए हौसला अफजाई के लिए, बड़ा मज़ा आया. Thank you.